My father and stepmother forced me out of the house when I was only 16 years old because they said I had disgraced the family name. 18 years later, I quietly purchased every house on their street, including the one they still lived in, and neither of them realized the new owner standing on their porch was the daughter they had cast aside. Stay with me while I walk you through what happened. And if this story moves you, please support the channel by subscribing, tapping that like button and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. My name is Dahlia Renfrew, and this all took place in a small town where everybody knew everybody's business. When I was a little girl, life was far from perfect, but I always believed my father, Walter Renfrew, cared about me. Everything shifted after he married Cora Vane. From the very day she moved into our house, the atmosphere slowly turned cold. At first, she was pleasant enough around me, but the kindness didn't last. She found a reason to criticize me almost every single day. If a chore was left unfinished, it was my fault. If the house felt untidy, somehow I was the one blamed. If anything at all went wrong, Cora made sure my father believed I was behind it. Eventually, he stopped asking for my version of events. He simply believed whatever she told him. Staying in that house grew harder with every passing month. I tried to keep my head down, thinking things would improve if I avoided conflict. Instead, it only made me an easier target. My stepbrother, Preston Vane, never had to answer for anything. He could break rules, leave the house in a mess, and talk back however he pleased without consequence. If I made the smallest slip, I was punished for it. Watching that double standard play out day after day hurt more than words could capture. I felt like a visitor in the only home I had ever known. The night everything collapsed was one of the harshest nights of that winter. Cora suddenly announced that her grandmother's ring had gone missing from her jewelry box. Before I could even process what was happening, she turned and pointed straight at me. I insisted again and again that I had never touched it. My voice trembled because I already sensed where the moment was heading. Cora never once looked at me with doubt in her eyes. She looked at me as though she had been waiting for exactly this chance. I turned to my father, hoping he would take my side. Instead, he glanced away for a moment and told me he was tired of the constant arguing. Those words cut deeper than the accusation itself. Cora grabbed my old duffel bag, stuffed a handful of my clothes inside, pulled open the front door and ordered me to go. My father didn't stop her. He didn't embrace me, argue on my behalf, or even ask where I intended to sleep that night. He simply stood there and watched the door shut behind me. I stood outside in the biting cold, clutching that duffel bag while tears streamed down my face. In that instant, I understood I no longer had a place to call home, and I silently swore to myself that I would never rely on either of them again. The first few weeks were the roughest stretch of my life. I had no destination and barely any cash. Some nights I slept at a nearby shelter, and other nights sleep never came at all because I was too anxious about what tomorrow would bring. Every morning I told myself that quitting was never an option. I still intended to finish high school, even if I had to manage it entirely on my own. I picked up whatever small jobs I could find. I wiped down tables at a roadside diner before class, restocked shelves at a corner grocery on the weekends, and did odd yard work for neighbors whenever they'd let me. The labor wore me out, but every dollar counted. I taught myself how to stretch a little money across several days. There were stretches when I skipped meals just to save enough for bus fare or notebooks. I never voiced a complaint because I knew no one was coming to save me. One afternoon after class, I wandered into the neighborhood bookstore to stay warm and finish my assignments. That's where I met Odette Bramwell. She was an older woman with a gentle face who ran the register near the front. She noticed I kept coming back nearly every day and stayed until the store closed. Rather than pressing me with uncomfortable questions, she simply gave me a quiet corner to study in. Over time, she became the first person who genuinely listened without passing judgment. As we spoke more, Odette realized I wanted something better for myself. She believed in my potential even during the moments I doubted it myself. She helped me hunt down college scholarships and walked me through filling out the applications the right way. She also handed me books about business, budgeting, and smart money decisions. Many evenings, she sat beside me and broke down concepts that felt overwhelming at first. She always reminded me that knowledge was something nobody could ever strip away from me. One day she looked at me and said, "The sharpest answer to betrayal is a life they never saw coming." Those words lodged themselves in my mind. Whenever exhaustion or doubt crept in, I recalled them and pushed forward anyway. Around that same period, whispers started reaching me through distant cousins. They told me my father and Cora were claiming I had run off because I was troubled and wouldn't follow rules. They painted themselves as the ones who had tried everything to help me. Most people in town believed their version because nobody ever asked for mine. Some neighbors who once greeted me warmly now looked the other way. It stung to know my reputation had been rewritten by lies, but I understood I couldn't burn energy trying to correct everyone's opinion. I decided the only thing within my control was my own future. Instead of chasing down rumors, I poured myself into building a life that would eventually speak louder than anything they had said about me. Graduation day felt nothing like what I had pictured as a kid. No family members stood waiting to hug me or snap photos. Still, I smiled because I knew exactly what it had cost to reach that stage. A few weeks afterward, I received the letter I had been praying for. I had won a scholarship covering most of my tuition. It wasn't enough to cover every expense, so I kept working while taking classes. My days stretched from early morning into late night, but I refused to complain about any of it. Every step I took reminded me I was shaping a future with my own two hands. During my first year at college, I grew fascinated with property renovation and construction finance. At first, I chose those classes because they seemed practical, but the more I studied, the more I fell in love with the subject. I noticed that many aging neighborhoods got overlooked because people only saw the decay. I started training myself to look past broken structures and abandoned lots. I learned to spot potential in places that could be rebuilt with patience and hard work. My instructors noticed how closely I studied the details that other students skimmed past. That recognition gave me even more drive to keep learning. I spent countless hours studying property values, renovation budgets, and investment timing. Whenever I had a free afternoon, I toured different neighborhoods and watched how small fixes could transform an entire block. After finishing school, I saved every spare dollar I brought in. It took years before I could finally close on my first small fixer-upper. The place needed extensive repairs, and plenty of people warned me it was a losing bet. Instead of backing down, I worked side by side with contractors, learned the renovation process firsthand, and weighed every expense carefully. Once the work wrapped up, the property looked completely transformed. Reliable tenants moved in soon after, and for the first time I watched my effort turn into something real. I repeated that same process with another small property, then another after that. Nothing ever came together overnight. Some projects stalled, and surprise repairs frequently cost more than I had budgeted. Even through the rough patches, I stayed patient because I understood lasting success came from steady, unglamorous progress. Every finished renovation taught me something new and unlocked the next opportunity. Even as my circumstances improved, I never forgot where the journey had begun. Certain small moments dragged old memories back to the surface. Standing alone outside a house at night, hearing a door slam shut or feeling icy winter air against my skin brought back that harsh evening everything had changed. Those memories no longer made me feel small. They reminded me exactly why I pushed so hard and why quitting was never an option, even on the difficult days. I refused to let resentment steer my future because I knew it would only hold me in place. Instead, I turned my past into fuel and kept walking forward. I wasn't chasing validation from the people who had discarded me anymore. I was constructing a life that proved something to myself first. The years moved faster than I expected. One project rolled into the next, and the small operation I had started slowly grew into a respected renovation and development firm. I brought on people who believed in doing honest work. We focused on restoring older neighborhoods instead of bulldozing them. We repaired homes, partnered with local families, and treated every property with genuine care. Because we honored our word and dealt with people fairly, our company built a solid name for itself. Many sellers sought us out specifically because they trusted we would treat them right. I never lost sight of how much trust mattered, because I remembered exactly what it felt like when mine had been shattered. As the company kept expanding, I spent more time researching different towns and neighborhoods before committing to new projects. I always searched for places everyone else had written off. One afternoon, while scanning through property listings, a familiar street name jumped out at me. At first, I assumed it was coincidence. Then I looked closer and realized it was the very neighborhood where I had grown up. I hadn't set foot there in years. Curiosity pulled me deeper into the reports. They showed that property values on that street had been sliding for a while. Several families had already relocated, and more homes were expected to hit the market soon. Many longtime owners were aging, while others simply wanted a fresh start elsewhere. I decided to drive through the neighborhood without telling a soul why. As I rolled slowly down the streets, I barely recognized the place. The lawns weren't kept up the way they used to be. Several houses had sagging fences, peeling paint, and empty driveways. Shops that used to bustle were now shuttered. It was obvious the neighborhood had been struggling for a long stretch. Sitting in my car, I quietly took it all in and let pieces of my childhood resurface. I felt a wave of emotions all at once, but I kept my focus locked on the opportunity in front of me. Back at the office, I instructed my legal team to start reaching out to homeowners who had already listed their properties. Every step ran through my company, and my personal tie to the neighborhood stayed private. Sellers only knew they were working with a professional development firm interested in revitalizing the area. One deal closed after another, and the purchases quietly began. Every few months, another house joined our growing portfolio. We got to work on repairs right away, making each home safe and inviting before handing it off to new families. The whole process moved forward quietly without drawing much notice. Nobody linked the company to the girl who had once lived on that very street. As more properties changed hands, I watched the neighborhood slowly come back to life. Deep down, I knew this project felt different from everything I had tackled before. This place carried memories that would never fully fade, and without telling a single person why, I kept moving forward one house at a time. Over the following years, the purchases kept coming. Some homeowners reached out to us directly after noticing the improvements on nearby properties. Others were ready to move nearer to family or begin a new chapter somewhere else entirely. Every transaction was handled with care and professionalism. Attorneys managed the paperwork, property managers oversaw the daily operations, and everything moved through standard business channels. There was never a reason for anyone to connect my name to what was unfolding on that street. As more houses became part of the portfolio, the neighborhood kept transforming. Fresh coats of paint replaced faded siding. Overgrown lots were cleared and maintained. Families settled into homes that had sat empty for months. Children ran outside again. Neighbors who had worried about the area's future started to feel hopeful again. Watching that shift unfold was rewarding, but it also stirred up memories I had spent years trying to leave behind. Whenever business pulled me nearby, I found myself steering toward that neighborhood. I never lingered for long. Most of the time, I simply parked a short distance away and looked around. Certain spots pulled me straight back into the past. A corner where I once waited for the school bus. A sidewalk where I used to walk home clutching my books after class. A small playground where I once spent afternoons reading alone. The neighborhood looked different now, but those memories stayed exactly the same. By then, our company owned nearly every house along that street. Only a handful of properties remained privately held. One of them belonged to my father and Cora. They still lived there, completely oblivious to the fact that the company quietly controlling almost everything around them belonged to me. To them, the changes probably looked like ordinary development. They had no reason to suspect anything more. Sometimes I wondered how they would react if they ever learned the truth. Would they feel shocked? Humiliated? Furious? For years I had pictured countless versions of that moment. Yet now that it felt within reach, I wasn't entirely sure how I felt about it. The anger that once burned inside me wasn't nearly as sharp as it had been in my younger years. Time had softened plenty of things. That didn't mean I had forgotten, though. The memories were still fully intact. I remembered the isolation, the fear and the ache of being discarded by the people meant to protect me. Those experiences had molded the person I eventually became. Even with everything I had achieved, there were still moments those old wounds resurfaced. Staring at the street from a distance, one question kept circling my mind. For years, I had assumed reaching this point would finally seal shut a painful chapter of my life. But standing there, I began wondering whether revenge actually delivered peace. Owning that street was something I never could have dreamed of as a teenager. Yet I still wasn't sure whether it would mend the part of me that had been broken so long ago. Only time would give me that answer. As the company kept working through the neighborhood, I began receiving detailed reports on the remaining properties. Most of it was routine, but one file caught my eye. It revealed that the house belonging to my father and Cora carried several unpaid bills. At first, I assumed it was an error, so I had my legal team double-check the public records. Everything checked out. The debt had been piling up for years. Tax payments had lapsed, loans had stacked on top of each other, and creditors kept sending notices demanding payment. I quietly scanned every page without saying much. It felt strange seeing how drastically their situation had shifted. Through additional records and conversations with people connected to local property dealings, I pieced together more of the story. My father had made one shaky financial call after another, feeding money into a string of failed side ventures and betting on quick wins that never landed. He ignored every warning from people who knew better. Rather than addressing problems early, he kept convinced the next opportunity would fix everything. It never did. Every misstep only buried the family deeper. There was something else that stung in a different way. Cora had spent years acting as though I had never existed in her world at all. Whenever my name came up, she dodged the subject or repeated the same tired story that I had left because I was impossible to deal with. She never owned up to what truly happened that freezing night. Even after all those years, she refused to take any responsibility for the choice she made. Hearing that stung, but it no longer caught me off guard. Some people find it easier to protect their pride than confront the truth. Then there was Preston. He was no longer the spoiled kid I remembered. He had grown into an adult who expected everyone else to clean up his messes. He drifted between jobs, spent money without thinking, and leaned on his parents whenever life got difficult. Instead of maturing into responsibility, he had carried that same entitlement straight into adulthood. The household that once believed he could do no wrong was now struggling to prop him up while barely managing their own affairs. The irony wasn't lost on me. Years earlier, they had labeled me a disgrace and treated me as the source of every problem. Now they leaned on neighbors for small favors and faced constant pressure from creditors chasing unpaid debts. The very people who had judged me so harshly could no longer keep their own lives in order. Taking all of it in, I felt something I hadn't expected. I didn't feel the satisfaction I had imagined feeling as a younger woman. Instead, I recognized that life had already handed them consequences far heavier than anything I could have engineered myself. Their own choices had quietly built the future they were now living inside. Without any interference from me, they had lost the stability they had always taken for granted. In that moment, I understood that time had already delivered its own version of justice long before I ever returned. A few months later, the moment I had wondered about for years finally showed up. The foreclosure on my father's house was finalized. After my legal team reviewed everything, my company submitted the required offer and legally acquired the property. It moved through the same process as every other purchase. Every document was signed properly, every payment cleared through official channels, and everything followed the letter of the law. Once the sale closed, only one step remained. Someone needed to meet the residents and explain what would happen next. I chose to handle it myself. I didn't tell a single person the real reason. I simply drove out to the house one quiet afternoon. Walking toward the front door, I felt steadier than I had expected. For years I had pictured this meeting fueled by anger. Instead, I felt calm. I knocked and waited. A few seconds later, the door slowly swung open. My father, Walter, stared at me without saying a word. At first, he looked puzzled. Then his eyes widened as recognition set in. The color drained from his face, and he froze completely still. Neither of us spoke for what felt like an eternity. 18 years had passed since we last stood face to face. He looked older than I remembered. I knew I had changed too. Finally, he murmured my name so softly I barely caught it. Before he could say another word, Cora stepped into the hallway to see who was at the door. The instant she spotted me, I saw the shock register on her face. She recognized me almost instantly, though she clearly couldn't grasp why I was standing there. I calmly introduced myself as the representative of the company that now owned the property. I handed her the official paperwork outlining the transfer and the next steps. She stared at the documents, then glanced back at me several times as if she couldn't accept what she was reading. She asked if there had been some sort of error. I told her plainly there was no error. Everything had been completed legally, and ownership had officially changed hands. As the conversation continued, both of them slowly grasped something bigger. Their house wasn't the only property my company owned. Nearly every house on the street now belonged to the same company. The street they had called home for so many years now sat under my ownership. Neither of them could hide the shock on their faces. They glanced around as though seeing the neighborhood through new eyes for the first time. The daughter they had thrown out with nothing but a duffel bag had returned as the owner of the very place they always assumed would belong to them. I didn't raise my voice or let anger creep into my tone. I stayed calm and professional as I walked them through the process. Standing there, I finally realized the biggest surprise wasn't that I had come back. It was that neither of them had ever imagined I could build a life so far beyond the limits they had set for me. Once the silence finally broke, my father asked if we could sit and talk. I agreed because I wanted answers more than I wanted an argument. We settled into the living room where I had spent so much of my childhood. For a few moments, nobody said anything. Then Cora slowly started speaking. She claimed she had been afraid all those years ago. She said she was only trying to keep peace in the household and believed siding with her own instincts was the only way to avoid deeper conflict. She admitted to making mistakes, but kept insisting she had felt cornered and didn't know what else to do. I listened without cutting her off. When she finished, I turned to my father. He showed no trace of regret at all. He folded his arms and said he still believed I had been a difficult teenager. According to him, everything that unfolded was entirely my doing. He insisted that if I had behaved differently, none of it would have happened. Not once did he say he was sorry. Not once did he admit he had treated me unfairly. His words didn't surprise me because they sounded exactly like the man I remembered. I took a slow breath before responding. I didn't raise my voice because there was no need to. I calmly reminded them what actually happened that freezing night. I told them I had pleaded with them to believe me when I was blamed for something I never did. I reminded my father that he never asked a single question before choosing to side with someone else over his own daughter. I described what it felt like standing outside with nowhere to go, wondering where I would sleep and whether I would even be safe. I explained how every day after that became a fight just to survive while still trying to stay focused on school and build something for myself. There were stretches when I felt completely alone, but I kept moving because stopping was never an option. Every hardship taught me something new about strength, responsibility, and grit. I never got the chance to lean on anyone because I learned early that I had to lean on myself. As I spoke, neither of them interrupted. My father lowered his head and quietly wiped away tears. Even Cora stopped trying to defend herself. The room went completely silent. I wasn't trying to make them feel guilty. I simply wanted them to finally hear the truth they had ignored for 18 years. When I finished, I looked at both of them and said everything I had built came directly from the decision they made that night. I would have gladly chosen a loving family over a hard life, but that choice was never mine to make. Since I couldn't rewrite the past, I chose to build a stronger future instead. In that moment, they finally understood something they never expected. The frightened 16-year-old girl they had abandoned was gone. Standing before them was a woman who had grown strong because she had been forced to face life completely alone, and nothing they said now could undo that truth. Once our conversation wrapped up, I stood and gathered the documents I had brought along. Legally, I had every right to begin the eviction process right away. Everything was in my favor. The house belonged to my company, and the law backed my authority. Years earlier, I probably would have used that power without a second thought. But standing there, I realized I didn't want my story to end the way theirs had. I told both of them they wouldn't be forced out that same day. Instead, I gave them time to find another place to live. I also explained that my company would cover their basic moving costs. Walter looked confused. He asked why I would help them after everything that had happened. I answered honestly. I told him I wasn't doing it because they had earned my kindness. I was doing it because I refused to become someone who found satisfaction in another person's helplessness. The choices they made belonged to them. The choice I made belonged to me. Over the following weeks, the move went forward peacefully. My company partnered with professionals to make sure everything followed the agreement. There were no arguments, no public scenes, and no attempts to embarrass anyone involved. I wanted the entire process handled with respect, because that's how I believed business should be conducted. During that stretch, people around the neighborhood slowly started asking questions. Many had noticed the changes taking shape over the years, but had no idea who actually owned most of the street. Once my name surfaced, a few longtime neighbors recognized it right away. They remembered me as the quiet girl who had vanished many years earlier without a trace. As word spread, the truth slowly came to light. People learned I hadn't run away the way they had always been told. They discovered I had been forced out of my own home and left to fend for myself. Several neighbors admitted they had believed the story my father and Cora repeated for years. Some even apologized for judging me without ever hearing my side. Hearing those words brought an unexpected sense of relief. I had spent so much of my younger life wishing someone would finally believe me. Now I no longer needed to defend myself, because the truth had reached the people who actually mattered. My success had done something arguments or anger never could. It exposed every lie without me chasing revenge for a single second. On moving day, I watched from a distance as the final boxes were loaded into a truck. I felt no joy watching them leave, but I also felt no bitterness. Justice had arrived in a way I never anticipated. It was never about taking something away from them. It was about proving the future they predicted for me had never come true. They believed I would fail without them. Instead, I built a life that stood far stronger than every lie they had ever told. On the day they finally left the street, I stood a short distance away and watched quietly. There was no scene, no argument, and nothing left unsaid between us that needed saying. They loaded the last of their belongings into the car and drove off slowly. I didn't watch them for long. I simply let them go. It didn't feel like the victory I once imagined it would. There was no rush of satisfaction, no surge of anger. Instead, there was a quiet sense of closure, like a long chapter of my life had finally shut for good. I walked down the sidewalk after they left and took in the neighborhood around me. It no longer resembled the place I had grown up in. Over time, it had transformed completely. With every property repaired and filled with new families, the street had slowly come back to life. What once felt broken and forgotten had turned into a place full of movement, safety, and hope. Children played outside again. Neighbors stopped to talk to one another. And the hollow silence that used to define the area was finally gone. I thought about how everything had begun with pain I never asked to carry. At one point, I believed I had lost everything that mattered. But over the years, that loss became the reason I worked harder than I ever imagined possible. It pushed me to build something bigger than myself. I didn't just want to fix up buildings. I wanted to create something that could shield others from the same loneliness I once carried. That idea became the foundation for every decision I made afterward. Instead of dwelling on the past, I focused on what the future could look like for people who needed a fresh start. My company launched programs for affordable housing across the region. We partnered with local organizations to place families who were struggling and young adults aging out of foster care without any support system. Every project carried the same mission. No child should ever feel like they have nowhere to go. Every finished home felt like another small step away from the life I had lived as a teenager. One afternoon, I returned to the same sidewalk where I had once stood years earlier with nothing but a duffel bag in my hands. I stood there quietly and looked at the house where everything had changed forever. I remembered the fear, the cold, and the feeling of being completely alone. But standing there now, I understood something important. My life had never been defined by that single moment. It had been shaped by everything I chose to do afterward. The success I built was never just about business or money. It was about proving to myself that pain could be turned into something meaningful. I finally understood that real victory was never about making anyone else suffer. It was about building a life so strong and complete that the past no longer had any power over my future.